Redpath, as many of you will know, was born in 1895, and it was a pivotal figure in a group of painters now referred to as the Edinburgh School. She had considerable commercial success in her lifetime, exhibiting with the Scottish Gallery, but also with Reed and Lefebvre in London. And since her passing over 50 years ago now, her reputation has grown and grown and grown, and she is now seen as one of the most important artists in Scotland in working in the 20th century. I am very, very pleased to welcome Anne Redpath's granddaughter, Lindsey Michie, tonight. This afternoon. Lindsey has been a great friend of the gallery for many, many years. And after working abroad in business, in car rental and IT consultancy, she moved back to Scotland in 2003, just after her mother passed away. And since then has very much been involved, at the heart of the Edinburgh art scene, working at Lion & Turnbull auctioneers, and laterally with the Royal Scottish Academy as chair of the Friends of the RSA. So a very warm welcome, Lindsey.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Good. Well, and so Lindsey, I think we should just get going. So a warm welcome to everyone. Now, Lindsey, you must have been a very young girl when your grandmother passed away. Could you tell us a little bit of your early memories of her?
Certainly. Yes, you're right. I was only 9, in fact, when my grandmother died in 1965. So I actually have very few memories of her, more impressions that have stayed with me over the years and what I've learned from my family. The last time I saw her was when she was in Edinburgh's Drumsheugh nursing home. My grandmother had tripped over one of the rugs in the drawing room of her London Street flat before Christmas and broke her arm. My father, Redpath's youngest son, David, had taken me in to see her. I do remember having a comic with me to read whilst my father and her chatted. I feel guilty to this day that I read my comic and probably ignored my grandmother. So sadly, my grandmother had underlying health issues and complications set in, and she sadly died on the 7th of January. My grandmother had taken taxis everywhere she went in Edinburgh and was a regular to a number of restaurants. Waiters and taxi drivers were amongst those who attended her funeral at Warriston Crematorium 2 days later, an indication, I think, of how she was regarded even by those who did not know her that well. I'm sure I was told as well that no women attended the service, as this was normal practice in Scotland at the time, which seems somewhat bizarre, but I believe that to be the case. I do remember my grandmother as being a very elegant lady. For special family occasions, she would take us to the Postillon restaurant in Edinburgh, which was in the old Caledonian Hotel. She always wore wonderful hats and coats that she purchased at Jenner's on Princess Street, and also at 1 or 2 favourite shops in London when she went down there for her exhibitions there. And so this is a lovely photograph of her here wearing these wonderful, wearing one of these wonderful hats and an elegant coat. So my sister and I refer to Anne Redpath as Edinburgh Granny, as she lived in Edinburgh latterly, and our maternal grandmother was called Hoyk Granny, as she lived in the Borders town where my parents had been brought up. As was normal for that generation, neither grandmother was the type to get down on the floor and play games with the grandchildren, but they loved being our grandmothers and were very kind to us. I recently rediscovered a postcard that Edinburgh Granny had sent me from Monton in the south of France when she was travelling, congratulating me on being dux at school. I must have been in primary school, and I can't imagine what I was dux of at that time. But there we are, it was a nice postcard all the same. After Edinburgh Granny died, my sister and I were allowed to choose a painting each from her studio. I still have the still life of flowers I chose, And for a 9-year-old, I think I had very good taste and sense.
I agree.
The painting I have is very similar in colour and composition to catalogue number 72 in the current exhibition, and also very similar to the painting my grandmother is standing next to in this photograph of her in the studio. And it's also the catalogue number 72 is being shown behind Tommy there on the screen. And that's a painting of my grandmother's in the exhibition.
Now, Lindsey, well, thank you very much for that. That's absolutely fascinating. Now, you've briefly mentioned your father's name, and many people will be aware of your father's painting career, David Michie. Could you tell us a little bit about family life in the Redpath Michie household?
Certainly. And I think you should have an image that helps illustrate the young life.
Here we are.
So this wonderful photograph here shows my father, who was the youngest son of Anne Redpath and James Michie. And all 3 boys were born in France between 1921 and 1928. And this photo shows my father on the extreme left-hand side, and the oldest brother, Alistair, on the extreme right of the photo, with the middle brother, Lindsey, next to him, along with 2 little girls who were obviously playmates at the time. This photograph was taken by the boathouse of the Chateau Gloria in Saint-Jean-Cap-Ferrat in the south of France, where they lived. And this particular photograph now, it was taken from the terrace of a hotel opposite the Chateau Gloria, now called the Chateau Saint-Jean, looking down at the boathouse where my grandmother and family lived. So after spending a few happy years living in the south of France, and who can blame them, my grandfather was the resident architect for a wealthy American who owned the Chateau Gloria. And my grandmother actually returned to Scotland in 1934 with her sons, and her husband moved to London to work with an architect's firm at that time. This effectively was when my grandparents separated, but they never divorced, and she wore her wedding ring until she died. My grandfather, James Michie, was obviously a troubled man, as he took his own life on the 22nd of February 1958 in Bristol, where he had been working. I never knew him and don't know if I ever actually met him, sadly. My father, David Michie, was the son who was physically and emotionally closest to his mother. After she died, the contents of her London Street studio were shared among the 3 sons, but my father took on all the administration and management of her estate and work. Alistair, the oldest son, lived in Wareham, Dorset with his family, and Lindsey, the middle brother, having worked all over the world with the General Electric Company, moved to Sydney, Australia, with his Australian wife and new son in the late 60s.
Now, Lindsey, you mentioned your Anne Redpath moved back to Scotland from France in the 1930s. Pictures of Hoyk versus Chateau Gloria in the south of France are quite different. What was life like for her and the family on their return to Scotland?
Well, first of all, it must have been a huge, culture shock making that move, from the south of France, going back to the borders. And, after returning to Hoyk and spending time there in the 30s and 40s, there was no regular source of income for my grandmother, apart from what her sons could provide. Apparently, my grandfather would turn up in Hoyk occasionally with extravagant and practical gifts, when what was really needed was money to put food on the table. As a result, my grandmother was known to exchange drawings and paintings for groceries and work to be done around the house. So there must have been a number of Anne Redpath originals in the borders area by the time she moved to Edinburgh in 1952.
And now, moving to Edinburgh then, Lindsey, we've talked briefly about the London Street flat already, which is just a short walk down from the gallery. and it is now marked with an inscription by the front door.
Yeah.
Her flat was, very much became an artistic salon for some of the great artists of the period. And for anyone who's interested, there's a terrific Robin Phillipson multi-person portrait of Anne Redpath's flat, which is in the National Portrait Gallery. Do you remember the flat?
Tommy, yes, I do remember my grandfather's flat as being very elegant, like her. She always liked to have white walls in her sitting room, as did my father. And in London Street, she chose to hang Venetian mirrors rather than paintings. And in this particular photograph, you can see her south-facing drawing room with basically bare walls, pretty rugs on the floor, which were, a trip hazard, obviously. And at the edges, you can see a painted desk on the left-hand side and a painted chest on the right-hand side, which is supporting the lamp and shade. I have that painted chest, in my flat now.
Wow.
I'm honoured to have it. And in this next photograph, you can see more of the lovely objects that she collected on her travels and was happy to have on display rather than behind, cupboard doors. You'll also see below this mirror the painted chest, which has her initials AR and the date, which is 1956. This might have actually become the toy box for my sister and I, but I
Terrific.
into it. Yeah. And then in this next photograph, this is the view of the kitchen of the London Street flat, which is actually overlooked the street. And you again can see the plates, cups and saucers all displayed without being hidden behind cupboards and so on. And unfortunately, you can't see a little cat that's sitting on the windowsill that was actually made by my grandmother's friend, the potter Katie Horseman.
And Lindsey, you must have heard lots and lots of stories and anecdotes from about your grandmother from your dad, David Michie. What were his lasting impressions of his mother?
Well, my father was very proud of his mother and her achievements. It cannot have been easy for him to have been an artist, like his mother, with inevitable comparisons and abilities, style and technique. But he never said that this had been a problem for him at all. Conversely, my art teacher at school, which is now the Scottish National Gallery of Modern Art, knew of my father's and grandmother's work and often expressed her frustration at my lack of talent. As a result, I gave up art as a subject as soon as I possibly could. My father always said there were two misconceptions about my grandmother. Firstly, that she took a career break to have children. For Redpath, family always came first, and her sons were always her priority when they were a young family. Only when they became more independent and she had the time and renewed interest did my grandmother resume painting. The second misconception, if you like, was my grandmother did not want to be identified really as a woman artist. It was being an artist that mattered to her. And I'm very proud that she was my grandmother.
Yeah. Well, Lindsey, thank you so much for those amazing insights into the life of your grandmother. Anne Redpath is, as we've mentioned at the beginning of the talk, she's one of the major figures in 20th century Scottish painting. But to have her brought to life as a granny, as Edinburgh granny, and David Michie's mother is very special. So thank you very much indeed, Lindsey.
You're very welcome.
We do have a quick question, if you don't mind.
Of course.
We've had a question from someone who's joining us. Hello, Bronwyn. Do you know if your grandmother collected Scottish pottery, in particular Quimper pottery?
Yes, she did, and we still have examples of that in the family. Yes.
Oh wow.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so that was the only question. So So to everyone who's joining us, thank you very much indeed. I hope you enjoyed it. And so it's goodbye from me and goodbye from Lindsey as well. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Tommy.